He ruled a billion-dollar empire with an iron fist, until one mother's tears shattered every wall he'd built around his heart. Hello, my wonderful family. I'm your brother, Mr. Harrington. May the Almighty cover your homes with mercy, bless your children with wisdom, and heal every broken heart among us. May joy never leave your household, and may your love always be protected. Each story I share is my offering of love and strength. Watch until the end, and together we'll keep this family strong. If your soul is with us, write present. If you walk with love, write I am with Mr. Harrington. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next powerful story we share. Subscribe, like, and share this video, so together we can reach more beautiful minds like yours. Tonight's story will break your heart, and then rebuild it stronger than ever. This is about Elena Carter, a woman whose strength could move mountains, but whose heart was breaking under the weight of poverty. And Alexander Pierce, a billionaire whose billions couldn't buy him the one thing his soul was starving for. In the heart of Manhattan, where glass towers scrape the sky and fortunes are made with the stroke of a pen, two worlds existed that were never meant to collide. One world glittered with champagne and designer suits, where a single business lunch cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month. The other world moved in shadows, cleaning those gleaming towers, serving those powerful people, invisible until the moment someone needed their floors scrubbed or their coffee poured. Elena Carter belonged to the second world, but she carried herself like royalty. 32 years old, with warm brown eyes that held depths of wisdom earned through struggle, she was beautiful in the way that comes from surviving everything life can throw at you and still choosing to love. Her hands worked double shifts at a Manhattan hotel, scrubbing floors where billionaires walked, but her heart belonged entirely to two 6-year-old miracles, her twins, Mia and Malachi. Those children were her universe, her reason for breathing, her motivation to keep fighting when poverty tried to crush her spirit. They deserved castles but lived in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. They deserved birthday parties with magicians and mountains of presents, but their mother had 30 crumpled dollars and prayers that somehow, someway, love would be enough. Alexander Pierce knew nothing about $30 birthday parties. At 38, he commanded a billion-dollar empire from a penthouse that overlooked Central Park. Steel gray eyes, jaw sharp enough to cut glass, presence that could bend boardrooms to his will with a single glance. He was the kind of man who bought companies the way other people bought coffee, who hadn't looked at a price tag in so long he'd forgotten they existed. But all his billions couldn't buy him the one thing his soul was starving for, a reason to feel human again. Tonight, these two worlds were about to collide in a way that would change everything. In an upscale bistro where the wealthy came to see and be seen, where champagne flowed like water and ordinary people felt like intruders. Elena would take her children there with her last $40, trying to give them one moment of magic on their birthday. Alexander would sit alone at his usual table, surrounded by everything money could buy but haunted by the emptiness money couldn't fill. But someone else would be watching from the shadows. Someone who had spent years positioning herself as the future Mrs. Alexander Pierce. Someone who saw Elena Carter's strength and beauty and genuine love as threats to be eliminated. Someone who would stop at nothing to protect the empire she planned to inherit. What you're about to witness is more than a story of love conquering all. It's a battle between authentic love and calculated greed. Between a mother's fierce protection and a socialite's ruthless ambition. Between the power of money and the power of the human heart. Tonight, you'll see what happens when a mother's tears meet a billionaire's lonely heart. When desperate love collides with dangerous obsession. When the courage to hope meets the cruelty of those who profit from despair. Before this story ends, you'll witness betrayal so shocking it will leave you breathless, sacrifice so beautiful it will restore your faith in humanity, and love so powerful it will remind you why the heart always knows what matters most. Are you ready to discover what happens when worlds collide and hearts break open? When a $30 birthday dinner becomes the catalyst that changes 3 lives forever. The story begins now, in a restaurant where the wealthy dine and the desperate dream, where one woman's last hope meets one man's first chance at redemption, where the most dangerous enemy isn't poverty or loneliness, but the person sitting 2 tables away, making plans that will turn love into a battlefield. Elena Carter stood at the bathroom mirror in her cramped Brooklyn apartment, braiding her hair with practiced efficiency. 32 years old, with warm brown eyes that held depths of wisdom earned through struggle and heartbreak. Her reflection showed a woman who had learned to carry herself with quiet dignity, even when the world seemed determined to break her spirit. Those eyes had seen too much for someone so young. They'd watched dreams crumble and promises shatter. They'd counted every penny, stretched every dollar, and calculated every possibility of making miracles happen with nothing but love and determination. Her hands moved through the familiar morning routine, hair pulled back into a neat bun, not for style but for practicality. These were hands that had once sketched fashion designs, fingers that had dreamed of creating beauty for the world to wear. Now they scrubbed floors and changed sheets and polished surfaces in rooms where people spent more on a single night than she made in an entire month. The Grandview Manhattan Hotel was Elena's world from 6 in the morning until 6 at night, sometimes later when they needed extra shifts and she needed extra money. It was one of those gleaming towers where oil executives and movie stars stayed when they wanted luxury and privacy. Elena knew every marble surface in that building, every thread count in those Egyptian cotton sheets, every brand name on those complimentary amenities that cost more than her weekly groceries. She moved through those opulent spaces like a ghost, invisible to the guests who lived in a world so far removed from hers they might as well have been on different planets. They left $100 tips as afterthoughts while she calculated whether she could afford both milk and bread in the same week. But Elena Carter had learned something that all the wealthy guests in all their expensive rooms had never discovered: that dignity wasn't something you bought, it was something you carried inside yourself. That respect wasn't handed to you with a platinum card, it was earned through how you treated others when you had every reason to be bitter. Every morning, before she left for work, Elena would kiss her sleeping twins goodbye. Mia and Malachi, 6 years old, with their mother's warm eyes and their father's smile, though their father had been gone so long that Elena sometimes forgot Marcus had contributed anything positive to their lives at all. Those children were her universe, her reason for breathing, her motivation to keep fighting when poverty tried to crush her spirit under its relentless weight. They deserved castles but lived in a one-bedroom apartment where Elena slept on the couch so they could have the bedroom. They deserved private schools and music lessons and family vacations, but their mother counted every dollar twice and prayed that love would somehow be enough to fill all the gaps that money left empty. Mia was the dreamer, always drawing pictures of princesses and castles, always asking when they could live in a house with a backyard like the one she saw on television. Malachi was the protector, even at 6 years old, always making sure his sister wasn't sad, always telling his mother she was the most beautiful mama in the world even when Elena felt anything but beautiful. They never complained, not even when dinner was peanut butter sandwiches for the third night running, not even when other children at school talked about birthday parties with bouncy houses and clowns and tables covered with presents. Elena's twins had learned, through their mother's quiet strength, that complaining wouldn't change their circumstances, but gratitude for what they had could transform even the smallest blessings into treasures. October 15th was approaching, their birthday. Elena had been saving for 2 months, hiding every spare dollar in a coffee can behind the flour in their tiny kitchen. Every morning she counted the crumpled bills and loose change. Every evening she added whatever she could spare from her tip money and the few dollars left after paying for rent and utilities and food. $53.17. It wasn't much by anyone's standards, but it represented hope. It was the promise Elena had made to herself that this year would be different, that this year her babies would have a real birthday celebration, something they could remember forever. She'd planned everything carefully. A small chocolate cake from Morrison's Bakery, the kind with buttercream roses that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Balloons from the party store, bright red and blue ones that would fill their apartment with color. Maybe dinner at Romano's Bistro, nothing fancy, just somewhere that wasn't their kitchen table, somewhere that might feel like celebration. But 3 days before their birthday, Elena's carefully laid plans began to crumble. She stood in Morrison's Bakery, looking through the glass display at cakes that seemed impossibly beautiful and impossibly expensive. The baker, a middle-aged man with kind eyes but tired hands, watched her count and recount her money, her lips moving silently as she calculated costs against her meager savings. "The small chocolate cake," Elena said finally, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. "The one with the pink roses." She handed him her debit card, the one connected to an account that held her hopes and fears in equal measure. The machine beeped once, twice. Then the harsh, familiar buzz of rejection that had become the soundtrack of her life. "Card declined," the baker said, not unkindly, but loud enough for other customers to hear. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her chin up, her dignity intact even as embarrassment tried to swallow her whole. "Could you try it once more?" "Sometimes the machine." "I tried it twice already," the baker said gently. "You have another card?" She didn't have another card. She had $48 in cash, but the cake cost $55. Elena stood there for what felt like forever but was probably only seconds, feeling the weight of other customers' attention, hearing the whispered conversations that people thought she couldn't hear. Behind her, a woman in an expensive coat whispered to her companion, "Some people really should think before they have children they can't afford." The words hit Elena like physical blows, but she didn't turn around, didn't respond, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply they'd wounded her. Instead, she looked down at Mia and Malachi, who were pressed against the glass case, their breath fogging the surface as they stared at birthday cakes they would never taste. $48 cash, Elena said quietly to the baker. "Do you have anything smaller?" The baker's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Elena had learned they often looked the same. "The small ones start at 50. I could maybe do a half sheet for 40, but it wouldn't have the decorations." Elena looked at her children, then back at the plain cake the baker indicated. It would do. It would have to do. But as she reached for her wallet, Malachi tugged on her jacket. "Mama," he whispered, "we don't need a big cake. We could make one at home, like we did last time." Last time. When Elena had mixed cake batter by hand because their electric mixer was broken, when they'd used candles from the dollar store and sang Happy Birthday in their tiny kitchen while rain drummed against windows that leaked when the storms got bad. Last time, when her children had pretended to be thrilled with homemade everything while Elena's heart broke at their careful gratitude. "Thank you," Elena told the baker, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll figure something else out." She took her children's hands and walked toward the door, past the woman in the expensive coat who was now selecting a cake that cost more than Elena made in 3 days. Past the display of perfect confections that might as well have been behind bulletproof glass for all the accessibility they offered to people like her. Outside the bakery, Elena knelt down to her children's level, smoothing Mia's braids and straightening Malachi's collar. They looked at her with such trust, such unwavering faith that Mama would make everything okay, that Elena had to swallow hard to keep her voice steady. "We're going to have the most beautiful birthday party," she told them, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. "Just different than we planned." Different meant dollar store balloons instead of bakery perfection. Different meant cake from a box mix and plastic forks and paper plates. Different meant pretending that homemade was better than store-bought while her children's careful smiles tried to hide their disappointment. But Elena Carter had learned to find miracles in the smallest moments, to transform love into celebration even when celebration seemed impossible. On their birthday morning, she woke before dawn and mixed cake batter by hand, humming softly so she wouldn't wake the twins. She hung dollar store streamers and blew up balloons until she was dizzy, creating magic with $5 worth of decorations and a mother's desperate love. When Mia and Malachi woke up, their faces lit up like Christmas morning. They didn't see the lopsided homemade cake or the cheap decorations. They saw their mother's love made manifest, saw effort and sacrifice transformed into celebration. They blew out 6 candles on a cake that tasted like hope and sang Happy Birthday with voices full of genuine joy. But Elena saw beyond their smiles to the careful way they didn't ask for more, the practiced gratitude of children who had learned not to want what they couldn't have. She saw the longing they tried to hide when they talked about other kids' birthday parties, the way they pretended homemade was better than store-bought to protect their mother's feelings. That evening, as they played with their few presents, coloring books and crayons from a dollar store, stuffed animals from a thrift shop that smelled faintly of other people's lives, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She counted her remaining money. $37 until her next paycheck. Enough for one last gift, one moment of magic that might make up for all the things she couldn't give them. "Get dressed," she told her children, pulling out their best clothes. "We're going somewhere special for dinner." Romano's Bistro wasn't fancy by most standards, but to Elena it represented everything she wanted to give her children. Cloth napkins and real plates, waiters who would treat them with respect, the simple dignity of being served instead of always serving. She dressed Mia in a pink dress that was getting too small but still looked pretty, helped Malachi into a button-down shirt from Goodwill that made him look like a little gentleman. She put on her one good dress, black and simple, the kind of dress that could take her from work to a parent-teacher conference to a birthday dinner without anyone looking twice. The hostess at Romano's looked at them with barely concealed skepticism, a black woman and 2 children who clearly didn't belong in even this moderately upscale establishment. But Elena met her gaze steadily, requested a table with the quiet dignity of someone who had every right to be there, and followed the hostess to a corner booth near the kitchen. It wasn't the best table in the restaurant, but it was theirs. Elena ordered carefully, a small pizza to share, 2 cups of hot chocolate for the twins, water for herself. $28 total. Manageable. Affordable. A birthday dinner that wouldn't leave them eating ramen for the rest of the week. The twins were mesmerized by everything. The cloth napkins they were afraid to unfold, the way the waiter called them young sir and young lady, the little tea lights flickering on each table like tiny stars. This was how other families lived, Elena realized, watching her children's wonder at things most people took for granted. "This is fancy, Mama," Mia whispered, her eyes wide as she looked around the restaurant. "Very fancy," Malachi agreed, sitting up straighter in his chair, trying to look like he belonged in this world of tablecloths and real glasses. Elena watched her children experience dignity, watched them feel important and valued and worthy of nice things. It was worth every penny, worth the anxiety of spending money she couldn't really spare, worth the ramen dinners she'd eat for the next week. But across the restaurant, in a booth that probably required reservations weeks in advance, sat a man whose attention would change the course of their lives forever. Alexander Pierce commanded empires, but tonight he sat alone with an untouched glass of bourbon, his billion-dollar deals forgotten, his steel-gray eyes fixed on something that made the powerful world he built seem suddenly meaningless. He was watching Elena. Watching her cut her children's pizza into perfect bite-sized pieces. Watching her laugh at Malachi's joke about the fancy napkins. Watching her discreetly count bills in her wallet when she thought no one was looking, calculating whether she could afford to tip the waiter who had been kind to her children. Alexander Pierce had everything money could buy, penthouses and private jets, art collections and investment portfolios that could fund small countries. But he'd forgotten what it felt like to witness pure, unselfish love. He'd forgotten the simple beauty of a mother's sacrifice, the quiet dignity of someone who created celebration out of nothing but determination and hope. For 38 years, Alexander had built walls around his heart higher than the skyscrapers he owned. Success had isolated him, wealth had insulated him, power had transformed him into something cold and calculating and efficient. He made decisions that affected millions of people, but he hadn't felt genuine human connection in so long he'd almost forgotten it was possible. Until tonight. Until Elena. But 2 tables away, another pair of eyes was watching Alexander watch Elena. Cassandra Voss, 35 years old, blonde and beautiful and dangerous in the way that only people who had traded their souls for status could be. She was Alexander's business associate, his occasional companion at social functions, the woman who had spent 5 years positioning herself to become the next Mrs. Pierce. Cassandra had clawed her way up from nothing, just like Elena, but she had chosen a different path. Where Elena had maintained her dignity and compassion, Cassandra had shed both like clothes that no longer fit. She had learned to see other women as enemies, other people's happiness as threats to her own carefully constructed empire. She watched Alexander's face change as he studied the black woman and her children. Watched his expression soften in a way she had never seen before. Watched him discover something that could threaten everything Cassandra had worked years to build. Elena Carter, with her natural beauty and obvious struggles and radiant love for her children, represented everything Cassandra feared most: authenticity. Real emotion. The kind of genuine feeling that could awaken something in Alexander that no amount of strategic manipulation could compete with. "Alexander," Cassandra said softly, leaning closer, her voice designed to sound concerned rather than threatened. "You're staring." But Alexander Pierce, who had built his fortune on reading people and situations with laser precision, was completely absorbed in watching Elena help Mia with her hot chocolate, watching Malachi try to use his napkin like the grown-ups at other tables, watching a family celebrate with such genuine joy that it made his chest tight with something he hadn't felt in decades: longing. At that moment, Elena looked up from wiping chocolate from Malachi's chin, and her eyes met Alexander's across the restaurant. For just a few seconds, The busy chatter of Romanos faded away. Two people from completely different worlds shared a moment of recognition, not of faces, but of something deeper. Elena saw loneliness and curiosity and a hunger that had nothing to do with the untouched meal on his table. Alexander saw strength and dignity and the kind of unbreakable love that his billions couldn't purchase. Then the moment passed. Elena looked away, focusing on her children, and Alexander lifted his wine glass with hands that weren't quite steady. But Cassandra had witnessed everything. The connection, the recognition, the dangerous spark of genuine interest in Alexander's eyes. She smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who had just identified her greatest threat. As Elena gathered her children and prepared to leave Romano's bistro, counting out exact change plus a modest tip she couldn't really afford, she had no idea that her brief moment of happiness had just made her the target of a woman who would stop at nothing to eliminate any threat to her position. Elena Carter left the restaurant with her heart full and her children chattering excitedly about their fancy birthday dinner. She walked into the night believing this had been the perfect end to their celebration, the beautiful memory she'd wanted to give them. She had no way of knowing it was actually the beginning of the most dangerous chapter of her life. Alexander Pierce sat in his booth long after his meal had grown cold, thinking about warm brown eyes and genuine laughter and the kind of love that transforms ordinary moments into miracles. For the first time in years, his empire felt empty compared to what he'd witnessed at that corner table. And Cassandra Voss was already planning her first move in a war Elena didn't even know had been declared, a war between authentic love and calculated ambition, where the prize was Alexander Pierce's heart and the casualties could destroy innocent lives. Three people whose paths had crossed for less than 5 minutes. Three completely different motivations that would soon collide in ways none of them could predict. The mother who wanted nothing more than to protect her children's happiness. The billionaire who had forgotten what happiness looked like until he saw it shining in a stranger's eyes. And the woman who would burn down the world before she'd let anyone threaten the empire she'd spent years building. What happened next would test whether love could survive in a world where money was power, power was everything, and some people would do anything to keep both. The sound of expensive leather shoes against polished marble echoed through Romano's bistro like thunder. Every conversation paused. Every head turned. Even the waiters stopped mid-stride to watch Alexander Pierce cross that restaurant floor with a kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Elena Carter froze in her seat, her hand halfway to her purse as she prepared to pay their modest check. She watched this man in the perfectly tailored suit approach their corner table, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Men like Alexander Pierce didn't walk toward women like her unless something was terribly wrong. Cassandra Voss watched from her table across the room, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips, her carefully constructed smile faltering for the first time in years. This wasn't supposed to happen. Alexander was supposed to observe from a distance, maybe send over dessert through a waiter, maybe leave an anonymous tip. He wasn't supposed to make direct contact with the threat Cassandra had already begun calculating how to eliminate. "Excuse me," Alexander said when he reached their table, and his voice was nothing like Elena had expected. Not the commanding steel she'd heard in news interviews, not the corporate authority that made CEOs tremble. It was gentle, almost tentative, the voice of a man who had forgotten how to talk to people without boardroom dynamics and billion-dollar stakes. Mia looked up with wide eyes, her hot chocolate forgotten. Malachi straightened in his chair, suddenly self-conscious about the small stain on his good shirt that Elena had tried unsuccessfully to scrub out that morning. "I couldn't help but notice it's someone's birthday," Alexander continued, his steel-gray eyes moving from the twins to Elena's face, lingering there with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons she couldn't name. Elena found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Yes, sir. Their 6th birthday." Alexander knelt down beside their table, bringing himself to the children's eye level, and suddenly he didn't look like a billionaire CEO anymore. He looked like a man who had been starving for genuine human connection and had just discovered a feast. 6 years old, he said to Mia and Malachi with complete seriousness, as if their age was the most important information he'd received all day. "That's a very significant birthday. Very significant indeed." Malachi, emboldened by this adult treating him like his opinions mattered, leaned forward. "Mama says 6 is when you start understanding the world better." "Your mama is absolutely right," Alexander said, glancing at Elena with something that might have been admiration. She sounds very wise. What happened next would restore Elena's faith in miracles, and simultaneously seal her fate as the target of a woman who had never learned to lose gracefully. Alexander didn't just pay for their dinner. He summoned the restaurant manager with a gesture that spoke of unlimited resources and zero patience for the word no. Within minutes, their corner table was transformed into a birthday wonderland that belonged in a fairy tale rather than their modest celebration. A birthday cake appeared that looked like it had been crafted by angels. 3 layers of chocolate perfection decorated with sugar flowers so delicate they seemed real. Balloons materialized in every color imaginable, not the dollar store variety Elena had saved for, but professional party balloons that bobbed and swayed like living things. Presents wrapped in paper that cost more than Elena's weekly groceries were stacked beside their plates. The other diners watched in fascination as Romano's Bistro was transformed into a private birthday party for 2 6-year-old children, whose mother counted pennies and whose birthday wishes had just been answered by a man who could grant wishes with the wave of his hand. Mia's eyes filled with tears of pure joy as she touched the sugar flowers on the cake with reverent fingers. Malachi laughed, actually laughed, with the kind of uninhibited delight that Elena hadn't heard from him in months. For one perfect moment, her children felt like they were the most important people in the world. "How did you know?" Elena whispered to Alexander as Mia and Malachi tore into presents with the enthusiasm of children who had learned to be grateful for everything and expect nothing. Alexander looked at her with those steel-gray eyes that seemed to see too much, understand too deeply. Every child deserves to feel special on their birthday. Every mother deserves to see her children's dreams come true. There was something in his voice when he said it, something that spoke of personal experience with disappointment, with birthdays that had been forgotten or ignored or turned into business obligations. Elena wondered what Alexander Pierce's 6th birthday had been like, whether anyone had ever made him feel special just for existing. As the evening unfolded in a blur of laughter and birthday songs and cake that tasted like clouds, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in 6 years of single motherhood and financial struggle. Hope. The dangerous, beautiful, potentially devastating hope that maybe the world wasn't as cold and cruel as she'd learned to believe. Alexander gave her his business card before he left, his fingers brushing hers in a contact that lasted exactly 2 seconds longer than necessary. The card was heavy, expensive, embossed with gold lettering that caught the restaurant's soft lighting. "Call me tomorrow," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "There are opportunities. Better positions. You're clearly intelligent, hardworking. Your children deserve stability, and you deserve so much more than you're settling for." Elena stared at the card in her hand, at the phone number that could connect her to possibilities she'd stopped allowing herself to imagine. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander glanced at Mia and Malachi, who were comparing their new toys with a serious concentration of children who had learned to treasure every gift. "Because some people are worth helping. And because your children's happiness tonight reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten." "What's that?" "That joy is the most valuable currency in the world. And you're rich in ways that have nothing to do with money." Elena watched him walk back across the restaurant to where Cassandra Voss waited with a smile that looked sharp enough to cut glass. She watched him sit down and resume his meal as if he hadn't just changed 3 lives with a gesture that meant nothing to his bank account but everything to her world. That night, Elena tucked her twins into their bed with hearts so full of wonder they could barely contain their excitement. They fell asleep clutching their new toys, their faces bright with the kind of happiness that comes from feeling truly seen and valued. Elena lay on her couch bed in the living room, staring at Alexander Pierce's business card until the numbers blurred together. Tomorrow she would call. Tomorrow she would take the first step toward a life where her children didn't have to settle for dollar store balloons and homemade everything. She had no way of knowing that across town, in a penthouse apartment that overlooked Central Park, Cassandra Voss was making very different plans for Elena Carter's tomorrow. Cassandra had built her life around one non-negotiable principle: threats must be eliminated before they become problems. She had watched Alexander's face during that birthday celebration, had seen him look at Elena Carter with something dangerously close to genuine feeling. She had witnessed the moment when Elena's quiet dignity and unselfish love had awakened something in Alexander that 5 years of Cassandra's careful manipulation had never touched. Elena Carter represented everything Cassandra feared most: Authenticity in a world of artificial relationships, genuine emotion in a circle of calculated connections, the kind of natural beauty that didn't require enhancement or maintenance or strategic positioning. Worse, she had children, which meant she could inspire Alexander's protective instincts in ways that Cassandra's carefully crafted vulnerability never could. The very next morning, while Elena was getting her twins ready for school and planning what she would say when she called Alexander's office, Cassandra was implementing a destruction plan that would unravel Elena's life thread by thread. Her first call was to Patricia Whitman, the head of housekeeping at the Grandview Manhattan Hotel. Patricia was ambitious, underpaid, and exactly the kind of person who could be influenced by the right combination of pressure and promises. "Patricia, darling," Cassandra's voice dripped with false concern, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think there's something you should know about one of your employees. Elena Carter." The conversation lasted exactly 7 minutes. By the time Cassandra hung up, she had planted seeds of suspicion about Elena's honesty, her work ethic, and her potential for theft. She had mentioned seeing Elena with expensive items that seemed inconsistent with her salary, had suggested that perhaps someone should take a closer look at the inventory in the rooms Elena cleaned. Cassandra's second call was to James Morrison, Alexander's head of security. James had worked for the Pierce family for 15 years and would do anything to protect Alexander's reputation and interests. "James, I need you to be aware of a potential situation," Cassandra said, her tone suggesting crisis management rather than personal vendetta. "Alexander made contact with a woman last night. Elena Carter. I'm concerned she might try to exploit his generosity, perhaps claim some kind of relationship or make demands. You know how these gold diggers operate." By noon, Elena Carter had been fired from her job, escorted from the Grandview Manhattan Hotel with a security guard watching her every move, and blacklisted from employment at any establishment in the Pierce hospitality network, which included half the luxury hotels in Manhattan. The accusation was theft. Specifically, the disappearance of a Cartier watch from room 1247, the penthouse suite that Elena had cleaned 2 days earlier. There was no evidence, no investigation, no opportunity for Elena to defend herself. Just the word of Patricia Whitman, who claimed the guest had reported the missing watch and identified Elena as the only staff member who had access to the room during the relevant time period. Elena stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel where she had worked for 3 years, holding a cardboard box containing her few personal items from her locker, trying to process what had just happened. The watch, she remembered it clearly. She had moved it carefully while dusting the nightstand, had made sure it was exactly where the guest had left it. "There must be some mistake," she had told Patricia Whitman. "I would never take anything. You know me. I've worked here for 3 years without a single complaint." But Patricia's expression had been stone cold, professional, untouchable. The guest was very clear. The watch was there when you started cleaning, gone when you finished. Security footage shows you were the only person in that room. "I'm sorry, Elena, but we have no choice but to terminate your employment immediately." Elena had asked to see the security footage, had requested to speak with the guest directly, had begged for any chance to prove her innocence. But Patricia had already moved on, already called security, already made the decision that would destroy Elena's livelihood and reputation in a single morning. Now Elena stood on the street with her cardboard box and her shattered world, trying to figure out how to explain to her twins that the stability they'd always known was gone. How to tell them that the birthday miracle they'd experienced was somehow connected to this nightmare they were now living. She called Alexander's office from a payphone, her hands shaking as she dialed the number on his business card. But his assistant's voice was cool, professional, completely different from the warmth Alexander had shown her the night before. "Mr. Pierce is unavailable. He's asked that I handle any calls from Ms. Carter. Could you just tell him I called? Tell him Elena called and I'm sorry, but Mr. Pierce has made it very clear that he doesn't wish to be contacted. If you continue to call, we'll have to consider it harassment." Elena hung up the phone with her heart pounding and her mind reeling. Something was wrong. Something had changed overnight, something that transformed Alexander Pierce from a kind man who had made her children's birthday magical into someone who wouldn't even take her phone call. She tried going to his office building, a gleaming tower in Midtown that scraped the sky and intimidated visitors with its marble lobby and uniformed security guards. But she never made it past the front desk. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the security guard said with practiced politeness, "but Ms. Carter is not authorized to enter this building. You're going to have to leave." Not authorized. Elena's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I just need 5 minutes. I need to speak with Mr. Pierce about a job opportunity. He gave me his card." "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to leave voluntarily, or I'll have to call the police." Elena looked around the lobby, at the wealthy people coming and going with the casual confidence of belonging, at the security cameras recording her humiliation, at the marble floors that probably cost more than she'd made in her entire 3 years at the hotel. She left voluntarily, carrying her dignity with her even as her world crumbled around her feet. That afternoon, Elena discovered the truth in the cruelest way possible. Her friend Maria, who worked in the accounting department of Alexander's building, called with news that made Elena's blood run cold. "I overheard something today," Maria said, her voice careful and concerned. "That woman, Cassandra Voss, the blonde one who's always with Mr. Pierce? She was bragging to someone on the phone about how easy it was to remove the pest before she became a problem." Elena sank onto her couch, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to Maria describe how Cassandra had orchestrated her firing, her blacklisting, her complete elimination from Alexander's world in less than 24 hours. "She called you a pest," Maria continued, her voice heavy with sympathy. "Said you were just another gold digger trying to use your kids to get to Mr. Pierce's money. Said she made sure you'd never get close to him again." Elena Carter sat in her small apartment with her twins at school, their new birthday toys scattered around the living room like evidence of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. She had lost her job, her reputation, her hope for a better future, all because she had allowed herself to believe in kindness for one single evening. But the cruelest part wasn't the job or the humiliation, or even the financial devastation that would force her to choose between rent and food in the coming weeks. The cruelest part was having to explain to Mia and Malachi that the magic they had experienced was gone, that the kind man who had made their birthday dreams come true had somehow transformed into someone who saw them as threats rather than children worth protecting. Elena Carter, who had survived abandonment and poverty and every form of heartbreak that life could devise, had finally reached her breaking point. Not because she had lost everything she'd worked for, not because she had been falsely accused and professionally destroyed, but because for one perfect night, her children had felt like they mattered to the world. And now she had to tell them it was all an illusion, that they were back to being invisible, that their mother's love would have to be enough to fill the void left by dreams that had been ripped away. As Elena sat surrounded by birthday toys that now felt like evidence of her own foolishness, she realized that some gifts come with prices too high to pay, that some miracles are actually curses in disguise, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is hope itself. Do you believe love can survive this kind of betrayal? Can authentic feeling overcome calculated destruction? Or are some wounds too deep for even the purest heart to heal? For 3 days, Alexander Pierce sat in his glass-walled office 60 floors above Manhattan, staring at spreadsheets that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The numbers that had once commanded his complete attention now blurred together meaninglessly. Billion-dollar acquisitions felt as substantial as smoke. Corporate victories that should have energized him tasted like ash in his mouth. Something was wrong. Something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered universe, and Alexander couldn't identify what had changed until he realized what was missing. The satisfaction was gone. The drive that had built his empire had simply vanished, leaving him hollow and restless in ways that no amount of success could fill. His assistant brought him coffee that grew cold while he stared out at the city skyline. His lawyers presented contracts that he signed without reading. His board of directors discussed quarterly projections that might as well have been discussing the weather for all the interest Alexander could muster. Elena Carter's face haunted every quiet moment. Her dignity in that corner booth at Romano's. The way she had looked at her children with such fierce, protective love. The careful way she had counted her money, trying to stretch every dollar into magic for their birthday celebration. Alexander had built his fortune on reading people, on understanding motivations and predicting behaviors with laser precision. But he couldn't understand why Elena Carter's memory affected him so profoundly, why a single evening with strangers had left him feeling more alive than he'd felt in decades. On the 3rd day, Alexander's restlessness drove him to do something he hadn't done in years. He walked the halls of his own company, actually observing the people who worked for him rather than seeing them as simply components in his corporate machine. That's when he overheard the conversation that changed everything. Two administrative assistants were discussing weekend plans near the elevator bank, their voices carrying in the marble-lined corridor. Alexander wouldn't have paid attention to their chatter except for one name that stopped him cold. "Can you believe what happened to Elena Carter?" one woman was saying. "Fired for theft after 3 years of perfect service." Patricia Whitman said she stole a watch from the penthouse suite. "Elena?" the other woman responded with obvious surprise. "I've known Elena for 2 years. She wouldn't steal a paperclip, let alone a Cartier watch. Someone set her up." Alexander felt something cold and sharp pierce his chest. Elena Carter worked at the Grandview Manhattan Hotel. Elena Carter had been fired for theft. Elena Carter, who had counted crumpled dollar bills to buy her children hot chocolate, was being accused of stealing expensive jewelry. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The phone calls Elena had made to his office that his assistant had deflected. The way security had been instructed to keep her away from the building. The systematic destruction of a woman whose only crime had been catching Alexander's attention in a restaurant where she didn't belong. Alexander Pierce, who could acquire companies with a phone call and ruin competitors with a signature, had been outmaneuvered by someone who knew exactly which strings to pull to manipulate him. Someone who understood his weaknesses better than he understood them himself. Cassandra Voss. That evening, Alexander confronted Cassandra in her penthouse apartment, the one he had been paying for without really thinking about the implications of financial dependence in their relationship. She was waiting for him with champagne and a smile that faltered the moment she saw his expression. "You destroyed her," Alexander said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that made corporate rivals surrender before negotiations even began. Cassandra's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind her eyes. Calculation, evaluation, the rapid mental adjustment of someone whose first plan had been discovered. "Destroyed who, darling? You're being very dramatic tonight." Elena Carter. The woman from the restaurant. The woman whose life you systematically dismantled because you saw her as a threat to your position. Cassandra set down her champagne glass with careful precision, buying herself time to construct her defense. "Alexander, you're being paranoid. I have no idea what you're talking about." But Alexander had built his empire on reading deception, on recognizing lies even when they were wrapped in beautiful packages. Patricia Whitman at the Grandview Hotel. James Morrison in my security department. The false accusations of theft. The instructions to my staff to keep Elena away from me. You orchestrated all of it. Cassandra's mask finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. That woman was using her children to manipulate you. She saw an opportunity to exploit your momentary weakness, and I protected you from making a mistake that could have cost you everything. The only mistake, Alexander said quietly, was trusting you. Cassandra's expression hardened into something sharp and dangerous. Be very careful, Alexander. You have more to lose than you realize. That secret about your son, the one you abandoned 20 years ago? The media would have a field day with that story. Billionaire CEO who abandoned his pregnant girlfriend. Your shareholders would love that. For 20 years, Alexander had lived with the weight of that secret. The girlfriend he'd walked away from because his father had convinced him she was just another gold digger after the family fortune. The son he'd never met because pride and fear had built walls higher than any skyscraper. Cassandra had discovered that secret 5 years ago and had been using it like a sword over his head ever since, threatening exposure whenever Alexander showed signs of independence from her influence. She had turned his shame into a weapon, his guilt into chains that bound him to her ambitions. But standing in that penthouse, looking at the woman who had destroyed Elena Carter to protect her own position, Alexander Pierce realized something that changed everything. He would rather face the truth and lose his empire than live another day as Cassandra's prisoner. Tell them, Alexander said simply. Cassandra blinked, genuinely surprised for the first time in their 5-year association. What? Tell the media. Tell the shareholders. Tell the whole world about my son. I'm done being afraid of the truth. Alexander walked out of Cassandra's penthouse that night feeling lighter than he had in 2 decades. The secret that had controlled him for so long suddenly felt like just another fact about his past, rather than a weapon that could destroy his future. But first, he had to find Elena Carter and try to repair the damage that his cowardice had allowed. Finding Elena wasn't difficult for a man with Alexander's resources. A few phone calls revealed that she had been living on unemployment benefits and food stamps since losing her job, that she had been applying for work at hotels and restaurants across the city, only to discover that her name had been blacklisted throughout the hospitality industry. Alexander found her on a Thursday afternoon at Riverside Park, sitting on a bench while Mia and Malachi fed ducks with pieces of stale bread, probably the only food she could afford to spare. She looked thinner than he remembered, worn down by weeks of financial stress and professional humiliation, but her dignity remained intact as she watched her children find joy in the simple pleasure of making ducks happy. "Elena," Alexander called softly as he approached, not wanting to startle her or cause a scene that might upset her twins. Elena turned at the sound of her name, and for a moment her face showed pure, unguarded surprise. Then the shutters came down, the careful protective mask that she'd learned to wear around people who had the power to hurt her. "Mr. Pierce," she said coolly, gathering her children closer to her side. "I'm surprised to see you here." "Elena, please. Let me explain." She didn't stand up from the bench, didn't give him the satisfaction of her full attention. Her voice was steady but distant when she spoke. "Explain what? How you made my children believe they mattered. How you let me hope for something better. How you disappeared the moment your perfect world was threatened by association with people like us." Alexander felt each word like a physical blow, deserved punishment for the pain his cowardice had caused. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know what Cassandra had done until 3 days ago." "You didn't know," Elena repeated, her voice heavy with disbelief. "You didn't know that I was fired. You didn't know that I was accused of stealing. You didn't know that your security team had me escorted from your building like a criminal. You just happened to be unavailable every time I tried to reach you. Cassandra manipulated my staff. She. Cassandra." Elena's laugh was bitter, empty of humor. "The beautiful blonde woman who was with you that night. She saw me as a threat, is that it? A poor black woman who dared to catch the attention of her billionaire boyfriend." Alexander knelt down in front of the bench, not caring that his expensive suit was touching the dirt, not concerned about the joggers and dog walkers who might recognize him and wonder why a CEO was begging forgiveness from a woman in a public park. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of genuine regret. "God, Elena, I'm so sorry. I was a coward. I let Cassandra control me because I was afraid of a truth I should have faced years ago. But I'm done being afraid." Elena finally looked at him directly, her warm brown eyes bright with unshed tears. "The truth? The truth is that people like you and people like me don't belong in the same world. The truth is that fairy tales don't exist for women who clean hotel rooms and count pennies for their children's happiness." "You're wrong," Alexander said fiercely. "You belong in my world because you are my world. You and Mia and Malachi, you're the only real thing I've encountered in 20 years of artificial relationships and strategic alliances." Elena shook her head, pulling her twins closer as if physical proximity could protect them from disappointment. "Pretty words, Mr. Pierce. But words are just words. I've learned not to trust promises from people who have everything while I have nothing." What happened next would stay with Elena forever, would restore her faith in the possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, the world could surprise you with genuine goodness. Alexander Pierce, billionaire CEO, dropped to his knees in that park, in front of dog walkers and joggers and anyone else who cared to watch. He pulled out his phone and began making calls that would either restore Elena's faith or prove her cynicism justified. His first call was to his team of corporate lawyers. "I want Cassandra Voss removed from every position in my company. Every board, every committee, every advisory role. As of today, she no longer represents Pierce Global in any capacity." Elena watched with growing amazement as Alexander systematically dismantled the power structure that had destroyed her life. His second call was to the Grand View Manhattan Hotel. "This is Alexander Pierce. You will rehire Elena Carter immediately with full back pay and a formal apology, or I will purchase this hotel and personally fire every single person who participated in her humiliation. The conversation that followed was brief and decisive. Elena Carter would be offered her job back within the hour, along with a promotion and compensation for the weeks of lost wages. Alexander's third call was the most difficult, the one that required him to face the shame he'd been carrying for 20 years. "Hello, Marcus? This is your father. Alexander Pierce. I know this is unexpected, but it's time we met." Elena listened with growing wonder as Alexander reached out to the son he had abandoned 2 decades ago, heard him take responsibility for his failures and express a genuine desire to build a relationship based on honesty rather than hidden from shame. But the most important call was the one Alexander made while still kneeling in the dirt at Elena's feet. His expensive suit forgotten, his billion-dollar empire reduced to secondary importance compared to the woman sitting on a park bench with her children. "Elena Carter," he said, his phone put away, his complete attention focused on her face. "I'm not asking you to trust me because I have money. I'm not asking you to forgive me because I can solve your problems with a phone call. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove that loving you and those beautiful children has made me human again." Elena looked down at this powerful man who was literally begging for her forgiveness, this person who could buy countries but was choosing to invest his heart in a family that society had taught him to ignore. She saw sincerity in his steel-gray eyes, genuine regret for the pain he'd caused, and something else that made her heart race despite her determination to protect herself. Hope. The dangerous, beautiful, potentially devastating hope that maybe fairy tales could exist, even for women who cleaned hotel rooms and counted pennies. "Stand up, Alexander," Elena said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "Real love doesn't kneel. It stands side by side." Alexander rose from the dirt, brushing off his suit, but his attention remained completely focused on Elena's face. "Does that mean you'll give us a chance?" Elena looked at her twins, who had been watching this extraordinary scene with a wide-eyed fascination of children witnessing something they didn't fully understand but recognized as important. She thought about the birthday celebration that had started this whole incredible journey, about the man who had seen her children's worth when the rest of the world treated them as invisible. "It means," Elena said carefully, "that I'm willing to discover whether the man who made my children feel like royalty is the same person standing in front of me now." What followed was not a fairy tale transformation but something more valuable, a genuine relationship built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure rather than wilting when tested. 6 months later, Elena Carter Pierce opened her own design firm in a converted warehouse in Soho, the space filled with natural light and the creative energy she'd been forced to suppress for too many years. Her first collection was inspired by resilience, clothing for women who worked hard and deserved to feel beautiful, designs that celebrated strength without sacrificing elegance. Mia and Malachi had college funds that would secure their futures, but more importantly, they had a stepfather who treated them like they were his own children, who attended every school play and soccer game, who had learned from his past mistakes and was determined to be present for every important moment in their lives. Alexander met his biological son, Marcus, a young man who had grown up wondering about the father who had abandoned him, but who found the strength to forgive when he saw the genuine change that love had brought to Alexander's life. It wasn't easy. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly, painfully, honestly, but they discovered that some relationships are worth the effort required to heal them. As for Cassandra Voss, she learned the hardest lesson of all, that real power isn't about what you can destroy, but what you can build. She had spent years tearing down other women, manipulating relationships, and pursuing status rather than substance. In the end, she found herself alone with nothing but the bitter knowledge that she had destroyed her own chances at happiness through her inability to value anything beyond personal advancement. Elena Carter Pierce stood in her design studio one evening, watching Alexander help Mia with her homework while Malachi showed him a drawing he'd made of their family. The scene was so perfectly ordinary, so beautifully normal, that Elena had to pause and remember the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the woman she'd been in Romano's bistro, counting dollars and stretching love to cover the gaps that money left empty. She thought about the birthday celebration that had seemed too good to be true, the devastating betrayal that had nearly broken her spirit, and the moment when Alexander had knelt in the dirt and chosen truth over comfort. This story teaches us that love isn't about what we can afford to give, it's about what we can't afford to lose. Elena Carter couldn't afford birthday balloons, but she had the richest heart in that restaurant. Alexander Pierce could afford anything money could buy, but he was bankrupt until love taught him how to live. Some people measure worth by wallet size, but the truest currency is the capacity to love without condition, to sacrifice without resentment, to build rather than destroy. Elena had always been wealthy in the ways that mattered most. It just took a billionaire's awakening to help the world recognize her value. Your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your zip code or the size of your house. It's measured by the size of your heart, the depth of your compassion, and your willingness to love even when loving feels dangerous. Do you think Elena and Alexander made the right choice in the end? And what would you have done in Elena's position? Would you have found the courage to forgive, or would the betrayal have been too deep to overcome? If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe for more stories that will inspire your soul. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their worth. And remember, family, you are loved, you are valued, and your story matters more than you know. Until next time, this is your brother Mr. Harrington, reminding you to keep love in your heart and strength in your spirit, because sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the most broken beginnings.